Hello and welcome to the Farming Week, the podcast from Agriland, keeping you up to date with all the latest in Irish agriculture. I'm Charles O'Donnell and I'm joined by Aisling O'Brien and Francis McDonald. Well, the weather has really picked up in the last week, so we hope you're able to enjoy that because it's hard to know how long it'll last for. On the flip side of that though, farmers who plan on using the good weather to take care of jobs around the farm have to contend with very high costs at the moment for green diesel and fertiliser, caused by the conflict in the Middle East. If you've been tuning into Agriland, you'll know that both the Irish government and the EU have proposed a number of measures to address these price increases. Of course, the effectiveness of those measures remain to be seen at the moment. Most recently this week, the European Commission launched what it calls a toolbox on energy costs, which is going to focus on transitioning to clean energy long term. That's just the latest announcement, but there's other measures potentially coming down the line that might provide more targeted support for farmers. And Aisling, could you maybe summarise those for us and what additional supports might be coming?
Yes, Charles. So, as we already know, the government here at home has unveiled two packages of measures currently as things stand, with a combined value of some €750 million, all in a bid to help people with rising fuel costs out there. And I suppose you're mentioning fertilizer as well. The latest estimates that we have are that the price of CAN has risen by around 20% since the start of March this year, while urea has increased by as much as 60%. And you mentioned green diesel there. Prices in Ireland, they've nearly doubled since February of this year, rising to over €1.80 a litre in some places due to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Now, as you mentioned, the European Commission announced a toolbox this week, and they are also looking set, we understand now, to back enhanced state aid in EU member states for farmers to help tackle fuel and fertiliser costs. And as you rightly said, Charles, this is the busiest time of the year on farms for using fuel and for using fertiliser. And if we're looking to a medium term and the longer term in terms of production on our farms, we need to be able to support the farmers now. And I think, looking at the longer term transition away from fossil fuels, and many farmers would argue it's pretty impossible to transition away from green diesel. But I suppose the immediate helps and the immediate asks for farmers are what we're looking at in this leaked document that we have seen in Agriland, these proposals from the Commission. And the document says that increases in fertiliser and fuel costs have been so steep that additional measures beyond what is already possible under state aid rules should be considered. And it says that any additional measures put in place by a member state would be temporary. And look, it should be noted, Charles, that this is only a working document at this point. It hasn't officially been endorsed by the Commission, but it perhaps is an indication of what we might get in the coming weeks from the Commission. We believe that there would be additional measures that would allow member states to address specific, unexpected, sudden and significant cost increases which risk ceasing the economic activity across the production of food and agricultural products. And the document warns that difficulty in purchasing fertiliser or fuel might have remarkable effects on the entire yearly production, jeopardising the economic activity of companies active in the sector. So, as I mentioned there, any additional temporary measures that member states put forward will be considered consistent with state aid rules only if they fulfill a number of conditions, and the aid would have to be granted on the basis of a scheme, we believe, with an estimated budget, and it would also have to be paid out before a certain date. And irrespective of the method of aid that perhaps the Commission suggests to member states, we have state aid ceilings as well, and that means that in the agriculture sector, a beneficiary can only receive state aid up to the amount of €50,000 over a 3-year period. And as well as that, Ireland is also limited to paying out €277 million in state aid for agriculture over the 3-year period as well. So there's a lot to play for at the moment, Charles. That's kind of some of what we believe is coming down the track from the European Commission that hopefully might help farmers to deal with the rising costs at the moment. And Irish MEP Kathleen Funchion, the Sinn Féin MEP, she's called on the government to make full use of state aid exemptions that may be brought forward to support farmers through these price shocks. And she said as well that the fertilizer plan that the Commission is drawing up. We know that EU Agriculture Commissioner Christoph Hansen, he's currently in the process of drawing up this fertilizer action plan. And we are expecting to see that in the coming weeks, perhaps the middle of May, or some indications at the moment. And that will not only focus on the short-term crisis, but also on the structural measures to reduce Europe's dependency on imported fossil fuel-based fertilizer as well, and becoming a little bit more resilient in that regard. But I mean, it's probably cold comfort at the moment to farmers who are out there trying to fill their tanks and get fertilizer and spread fertilizer, Charles. But that seems to be the moves at a European level at the moment.
And while we're talking about the EU, Aisling, you're here in the Agriland office today rather than your home base of Kerry because you've just got off a plane from Brussels. So what have you brought back for us in terms of key EU developments that farmers should be aware of?
Yeah, well, they say the old saying is a day out of Kerry is a day wasted, Charles, but not in this instance. A very productive trip over to the EU at a very opportune time, I think, as well, because Ireland, of course, is going to hold the presidency of the Council of the European Union from July of this year for a period of 6 months, to bringing us to the end of December. And what we heard this week in Brussels is that it is expected that an outline of the next long-term EU budget, or multi-annual financial framework, the MFF, which includes, of course, the next common agricultural policy, that may become clear before the end of the year. And then we'd be looking ahead into early 2027 for the trilogue discussions, which, of course, essentially refers to the three EU institutions: the Commission, the Council and the Parliament. Now, the European Commission's proposals for the next CAP, as we know, would see a move away from the traditional two-pillar structure, and CAP would be integrated into national and regional partnership plans. The total, I suppose, earmarked amount for that is some €865 billion. And out of that, there would be a minimum of 300 million, which would be ring-fenced for farmer income supports. Now, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has also confirmed that some 48 billion from the flexibility reserve may be used for agriculture from 2028. And in the balance between the 865 billion and the 300 million, there is a level of additional flexibility for member states, I suppose, depending on their agriculture industry, their different needs as well. But as we know, farming organisations have really raised concerns about this, and perhaps pitting, rural supports against farming supports, and everybody pulling from the same pot, essentially. And perhaps that the common agricultural policy might lose its commonality, that member states would go in a different direction. But that's something that the European Commission doesn't agree with, and they feel that it is giving, I suppose, more autonomy to member states to make kind of define choices depending on what the need is of each individual country. The needs of Ireland are different to the needs in Greece, so I suppose it reflects it in that way. And I caught up with Liam McHale, the Director of European Affairs with the Irish Farmers Association in Brussels this week, Charles, and he told me he believes that Ireland's upcoming EU presidency provides a huge opportunity as the discussions around the MFF and the next CAP budget continue at pace. So the presidency, as I said, it's going to come in July. And what we're seeing is there'll be legislation, there'll be proposals. And Liam said that the original proposals put forward by the European Commission on the next CAP, that would reduce maybe a nominal reduction compared to the current cap of somewhere between 20 and 24%. And he said that's perhaps our biggest challenge. And we did report how the European Parliament Budget Committee, it has proposed to add an additional 139 billion to the Commission's plan. So the horse trading is going on all the time, Charles. We've been saying that on the podcast for many months now. This is going on at a European level. So the Parliament is now exercising its voice on these proposals, and we'll see how it goes over the coming months ahead. But Liam McHale said that there had been a cut in the initial budget, but he did say President von der Leyen and the Commission, they have come back with some proposals that would increase the amount of the initial funding for farmers. But he said it's not ring-fenced, it's not guaranteed, but it's certainly a step forward. And he sees that maybe the Parliament would hopefully support the position of farmers in their request for an increased budget for the agriculture sector as well. But he did acknowledge, and it's something we have said here before, Charles, there's many competing priorities at European level. And there was a lot of discussion in Brussels this week, I suppose, about defence, about the threat posed perhaps by Russia. We've the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. So the real pull this time is towards defence and security spending for the overall EU budget, whereas maybe perhaps in the previous CAP cycle it was the environmental concerns were pulling at it a bit more. And Liam McHale said that is something beyond the next CAP cycle and to future CAP cycles. What will be the further pressures? And inevitably there will be further pressures on the CAP budget. But he said against all of that, they maintain that food security is non-negotiable and that we need to defend our farmers and to continue with food production in Ireland and across the EU.
And I'd imagine, Aisling, that Mercosur was also a point of discussion because, as we know, it's going to apply provisionally from May 1st. So what was the talk about Mercosur out there?
Yes, Charles. So Friday week is D-Day because we will see the provisional application of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement from that date. The deal, of course, 25 years in the making, and it will create one of the world's biggest free trade zones. And as we well know on the podcast, as part of the agreement, it will allow for an additional 99,000 tonnes of Mercosur beef to enter the EU market with a 7.5% duty, which will be gradually phased in. Also, what will be gradually phased in is a 180,000 annual tonne duty-free quota for poultry. Now, the European Commission says the deal contains safeguard clauses which can be applied in cases where imports from Mercosur countries threaten to cause what they term serious injury to EU producers. And the EU has also committed to increase border controls as well by a third between this year and next year. Now, Liam McHale told me that while there are safeguard clauses, unfortunately, we have to wait until there maybe is a negative impact on the market for that potentially to be activated. And he said there is a rapid increase in the eagerness of the Commission to tie up trade agreements around the world. We saw an agreement with India, we've seen the agreement with Australia, and there are moves to complete a US trade deal as well. And Lee McHale said, we believe that if you were to add them up, the cumulative effect of these trade deals, he believes will have an impact on sensitive sectors going forward. And he said they will be watching closely the import figures from South America, from the Mercosur countries going forward as well. And look, as part of our visit to Brussels this week, we spoke with a senior EU official. And speaking about Mercosur in particular, this official said that objective facts on the trade deal were sometimes ignored in the agri-food sector in Ireland, in France, and other countries that were strongly opposed to the deal. But nonetheless, this official said it is also the case that the Commission, the EU institutions in general, but equally national governments could arguably have done more to explain and to reassure our farmers and citizens about the deal. And they said that there is clear learning for us in terms of how to communicate better and more impactfully. And the official said that the worst fears around Mercosur, while coming from understandable starting points, were misplaced. They said precisely because of how hard they negotiated with Mercosur to ensure that any market openings in sensitive sectors would be carefully collaborated, phased in over time, and that any risk of market disruption was fully prevented through these safeguards that were built into the deal, which the official said are the strongest ever in an EU trade agreement. Now, the EU official did acknowledge as well, of course, as we reported previously, a shipment of Brazilian beef treated with an antibiotic that is banned in the EU did make its way into a number of member states in the EU, including Ireland last year. And they did say that it is true that the system in place for detecting such breaches in the system found this breach, and that's how we know it happens, and that shows that the system works. But at the same time, as I said, to reassure farmers, to reassure the public about this, and I suppose in a bid for this breach never to reoccur, they are strengthening controls at EU borders and reinforcing cooperation with Mercosur countries as well. And they did say that European consumers have to have trust in our systems, and we have the highest standards for food and for food safety as well. So a lot to discuss. You'll see a lot of coverage from Brussels on Agriland on our website and app this week. A very busy time. And as we look ahead to the EU presidency, Charles, will be speaking, no doubt, from a European lens for the coming months ahead, I'm sure.
And just while we're on the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, we had a story this week that over 1,000 tonnes of animal products from Brazil passed through Dublin Port so far this year. If you're interested in reading more about that, you can check out the article on the Agriland app and website. But we'll move on now, and you will have certainly heard that former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar got on some hot water in the last week over comments he made on rural Ireland. So Francis, can you tell us how all this started?
Well, the former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar was chatting on the Path to Power podcast with Matt Cooper, and he made some pretty direct comments about farmers. He basically said that while farmers often see themselves as the backbone of the economy, bringing jobs and income into the country, in reality, they can sometimes cost Ireland more than they can contribute. And he went on even further and said that people in rural Ireland can be quick to claim they're the real workers, feeding the country and paying the bills, while in his view, it's actually urban Ireland that's carrying more of the financial weight through taxes. Now, as you might expect, this didn't exactly land quietly. The Minister for Agriculture, Martin Hayden, moved pretty quickly to distance himself from those remarks, and he said outright he completely disagrees with them.
Completely disagree with Leo Varadkar's comments, and the reason I believe he's wrong is because that economic activity in rural Ireland drives our rural economy and our urban dwellers who love to go on holidays down the country over the summer. You know, it's not just the tourism industry that has our vibrant rural communities. It's our fishers, it's our farmers and the work they do all year round that drives those communities on, that keeps our well-kept landscape, our countryside, that has Ireland as a beautiful place to visit, where our rural towns and villages are being driven on because of that multiplier effect, and our farmers spend the money locally and drive that on locally.
But Charles, the reaction didn't stop there. Sinn Féin's agriculture spokesperson Martin Kenny came out very strongly, calling the comments outrageous. In fact, he pushed back on the idea that farmers are somehow dependent, especially when you consider the scale of Ireland's agri-food sector. And this is really where the numbers come in, because Irish agri exports are worth over 20 billion euros a year. And that is, of course, a huge part of the economy. Now, of course, farmers also do receive supports under the EU's Common Agricultural Policy CAP. But the argument from critics is that those supports exist for a reason. They ensure food security and keep farming viable in a tough, highly regulated market. Now, we also heard this week from farming organisations and rural representatives about what they thought about the former Taoiseach's comments, and they were pretty blunt. They described these comments as insulting and misleading and said they show a disconnect from how the real economy works. And one point that has really stood out over the last few days about this argument is how local Irish agriculture actually is. Unlike some industries here that rely on imported materials or overseas production, farming is largely homegrown. So the argument has been that the value just doesn't exist on paper, it spreads throughout communities. We've heard from lots of politicians throughout the week, and some of those included the MEP Kieran Mullooly, who described the former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar's recent comments as insulting, misleading, and a clear sign of how disconnected some political voices have become from the real economy of this country. We also heard from the MEP Sean Kelly, and he said that he thinks it's very important not to be making distinctions between urban and rural. They're both equally important. So for many, this debate hasn't just been about economics this week, Charles. It's about how we value the role of farmers in Ireland.
Thanks for that, Francis. Well, staying with politics now, and Kerry TD Danny Healy-Rae has been formally removed from the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Agriculture and Food, following his decision not to support the government in last week's confidence motion. So, Aisling, this obviously goes back to the fuel protests and the fallout there. So, what happened to Healy-Rae, and do we know who his replacement on the committee will be?
Yes, Charles, definitely another dramatic week in Dáil Éireann. Perhaps not as dramatic as last week, because as we did report last week on the podcast, Michael Healy-Rae did announce in the Dáil during that motion of confidence debate in the government that he was going to be tendering his resignation as Minister of State at the Department of Agriculture over the government's handling of the fuel protests. And his brother and fellow Kerry Independent TD Danny Healy-Rae also withdrew his support for government and returned to the opposition benches. But it was something, I suppose, that Danny had signalled that he would do in advance of the Dáil vote. Now, following the outcome of that vote, the government then moved, as you said, to remove Danny Healy-Rae as a member of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Agriculture and Food. So each Oireachtas committee includes 9 TDs, 5 of whom are drawn from the government ranks, including the chair, and then the remaining 4 are made up of opposition TDs. There's also senators, it should be mentioned as well, on the Oireachtas committees. Now, it is understood it's the government's position that Danny Healy-Rae was given a seat on this committee in recognition of his support for the coalition government. But I spoke with Danny Healy-Rae and he told me that he felt he was entitled to hold on to his seat in the committee. Have a listen. Danny, was your position on the committee, I suppose, in return for your support for the government, and now that you've withdrawn that, is that what's happening here?
That's not the way I was understood that I was appointed. I was not appointed as a member of the coalition or of Fianna Fáil. I was appointed as an independent member, and that's the way I understand it.
But based on your support for the government, which now you've withdrawn?
They never said that to me.
So that was Danny Healy-Rae speaking to me there, Charles. And he said to me if he was removed from the committee, he would have no regrets. He said he was standing with the people. And he said that was because they're the people that elected him and that they're the people he'll be staying with regardless. So I suppose fast forward to Tuesday of this week then, and the Dáil did vote to remove Danny Healy-Rae from the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Agriculture and Food. And they replaced him with fellow Kerry TD Michael Cahill, who's a Fianna Fáil TD from the south of the county as well. So these motions generally to move representatives from Oireachtas committees, they're not debated, but it is possible for a vote to be called, and that's exactly what Danny Healy-Rae pushed for this week. Now, it was expected if that was called for, as the government holds a majority, that, you know, they would, I suppose, this motion would be passed, this report would be passed to remove Danny Healy-Rae, and that is exactly what happened, because it was a report from the Dáil's Standing Committee on Selection, and that committee is responsible for nominating members to and discharging them from the various Oireachtas committees, and the report was adopted by the Dáil with 86 votes in favour and 56 against and 2 abstentions. And I did speak to Danny Healy-Rae separately as well. We're yet to catch up with Michael Healy-Rae following his decision to step back. Charles, his son, Jackie Healy-Rae, told an IFA meeting down in Kerry that his father is currently recharging his batteries, and he's going to be getting back to work and to representing the people, because that's what his focus is. But I suppose Danny Healy-Rae told me he believes that his brother's decision to resign as a junior minister was because of the anger and anguish and hurt that people were feeling over the rising cost of fuel. And Danny said that Michael was doing very good work in the forestry section of the department, and everybody recognised that, and he was doing a lot of other work besides that. And he denied that Michael's decision to resign and to return to the opposition benches, in what has been speculated, was linked to Danny's decision to vote against the government, that it was kind of a two Healy-Raes in support of the government, and that was the deal that was struck. Now, that is something, I suppose, that Danny said isn't the case, that this was Michael's own decision. But I suppose we'll wait and see when Michael is back out and about and doing interviews, and hopefully we'll catch up with him and hear his side when he's available.
Moving on now, this week saw further financial results announced by dairy processors, including Tirlán, with the company's CEO providing some insight into the current situation in global dairy markets. So Aisling, can you tell us about this?
Yes, Charles. So Tirlán announced its financial results for 2025, which showed an increase in revenue of 10% to €2.94 billion. And the co-op's operating profit for last year stood at €63.7 million, which it said was within its target range. The business said its milk collections increased by 7% last year, while milk solids were up 9%. Now, Tirlán said it processed around a third of Ireland's milk pool last year, with 3.2 billion litres processed, and its average milk price for last year was 54.4 cent a litre compared to 52 cent a litre back in 2024. Now, while last year was very strong for Tirlán, this year is shaping up to be very different, Charles. And Sean Malloy, the CEO of Tirlán, told Agriland this week that in his 20 years in the dairy business, he's never seen such uncertainty and volatility in international markets as we're currently seeing. And he said that current unpredictability in the dairy markets, along with global events, is making it very difficult to predict where milk prices will go over the next year. And he said the milk price that Tirlán are paying in some cases isn't covering the full cost of production. And he said that's a very difficult place for farmers to be. And he said it is difficult to go beyond 2 to 3 months in milk price forecasting. He said it's very difficult given the current state of play on markets. And he said that there has been some welcome gains in the market at the start of the year, but they now seem to have stalled. But he did say on the demand side, the situation remains somewhat positive. but there has been a divergence in the market across different product groups. Now, as we did report last week, Tirlán has announced its March milk price, and they are saying that they're planning to hold that base price then for the following 2 months. So it's a 3-month commitment, and it's all bidding, I suppose, to give some sort of reassurance to suppliers that this is what maybe the future looks like over the peak production months ahead as well. And you can read more from Sean Malloy's comments to Agriland. It's quite an extensive interview on our website and app. Also this week, Charles, we had financial results published by Sligo headquartered Arrivo Co-op, which said it had its highest ever milk intake of 544 million litres last year. Now, Arrivo said that it had a record financial performance for the full 2025 financial year. Group turnover increased by over 12% to over €814 million, and operating profit rose to €18.7 million. Now, the co-op paid an average milk price of 55.3 cent a litre last year, which was up 2.34 cent a litre on 2024. And the co-op's portfolio, as we know, it has 4 different divisions: agribusiness, livestock marts, consumer foods and dairy ingredients. And the results highlight that its agribusiness operation saw revenues increase by 8.5%, while livestock mart business reported a 38.4% jump in turnover to over €162 million. And last month, Arrivo confirmed, as we know, that it had entered into a new strategic partnership with the Belfast-based co-op Dale Farm, and that's going to initially focus on projects which will include byproduct utilisation and added value protein. And last month, as we reported, Arrivo confirmed that it had entered into a new strategic partnership with the Belfast-based co-op Dale Farm. And Arrivo said this partnership will initially focus on projects that will include byproduct utilisation and added value protein. And Charles, just before I suppose we leave discussions about milk supplies, the European Milk Board today warning that record milk volumes globally are going to drive Europe towards the next price collapse. They say that is going to happen unless their call for voluntary volume reduction scheme to be implemented by the European Commission is introduced. They say it's a key instrument to stabilise volumes in the short term and to prevent a further price collapse. But the EMB has claimed that several key countries are still blocking decisive action at European level, and they really did make a direct appeal to Germany, France and Denmark in particular this week.
And Aisling, we also heard this week some comments on fixed milk price schemes from a person that we actually referenced in last week's podcast. So what's this about?
Yeah, so Jackie Cahill has been appointed by Minister for Agriculture, Martin Hayden, as the chair of the National Milk Agency. That agency was established in 1994 to regulate the supply of milk for liquid consumption throughout the state. Now, Jackie Cahill appeared before the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Agriculture and Food recently, and he told that committee that he believed farmers got so badly burned by fixed milk price contracts that they will be consigned to history. In his view, he said he didn't see any fixed milk price contracts ever being on the agenda again. He said suppliers got burned with them, and I cannot see it happening. And I suppose he spoke about the remit of the milk agency. One of their key functions is to maintain registers of producers, processors and milk supply contracts between processors and producers. But it's not the job of the agency to set prices, but they do, I suppose, have a look at contracts to make sure that they are fair for producers. So I'll imagine that Jackie will be a pretty outspoken chair of that committee, and I'm sure we'll be hearing lots from him over the coming years in his new position.
No doubt about it. But we'll move on now, and this is the second week of new changes on animal movement rules in relation to TB. There was some criticism of those rules after they came in last week, but Aisling, 2 weeks in now, where do we stand?
Yeah, so according to the Irish Creamery Milk Suppliers Association, the ICMSA, they say there's utter confusion around the new TB rules, which are now in force, as you say. We're in the second week of them, and it is all part of the government's new TB action plan. And farmers will, if you've gone to the mart, if you're buying or selling animals, you will have seen some changes on how cattle can move through livestock marts. As we know, farmers who are selling or buying cattle, animals are being assigned to particular groups so they can be presented for sale, and those groups are assigned by the Animal Identification and Movement, the AIM system, which is operated by the Department of Agriculture, that notifies the mart of the animal specific grouping. But the ICMSA Deputy President Eamon Carroll this week said there's utter confusion about these new requirements in marts. He's calling for changes and clarifications, particularly in relation to the online compliance certificate. He said that the farm organisation has been inundated with queries around the warning at the top of the compliance cert that's issued when a purchaser and a seller are completing a sale, and he's called for a lot more clarity from the department to address this issue. And somebody else who was calling for simplification in the past week is Maurice Brosnan. Maurice is the manager of Varadkar Mart in County Kerry, and he has urged the department to simplify the new rules, which he feels are far-fetched. He said that the mart has been taking multiple calls as well from farmers who are unsure about how the changes will impact on their cattle. And he said, and as of today, any animal suitable for breeding should be tested within 30 days. Any cull cow has to be tested within 6 months of the sale date, just to have all the customers in the ring be able to purchase them. If they're over 6 months, so if that test is over 6 months, you're cutting down, he said then, on the amount of people that can purchase your cull cow. And in Maurice Brosnan's opinion, the only person that this is suiting is the factory. He said they're trying to confine people to sell their animals and they're cutting down the markets more or less. And he believes that the farmers won't get the full value of the animals if they stick to these new rules. He also believes that wildlife is the biggest issue when it comes to the spread of bovine TB rather than the movement of animals to marts. And we did previously report how Minister for Agriculture Martin Hayden said his department continues to engage with the marts and update its dedicated TB website for all herd owners with updated advice on these changes. But it seems like it's still in that bedding in period, Charles, and it is still causing a level of confusion for farmers on the ground and for those operating marts as well. And for farm organisations, they seem to be fielding a lot of queries.
Finally this week, we're going to bring you right up to date on the latest developments on farm schemes. So Aisling, what do farmers need to know as of today?
Okay, Charles. So let's kick off with acres. And this week saw the beginning of balancing payments totaling around €37 million being paid to 47,000 acres participants. And this week's payment run will bring the total paid in core scheme payments to farmers in acres to over €783 million since the scheme began back in January of 2023. Now, the beginning of the 2025 balancing payments in mid-April is actually taking place a month earlier than the previous year. And we're told that it's envisaged that over 88% of the farmers in acres will have received their acres 2025 balancing payment by the end of this week. But Minister Hayden said he is conscious that while over 99% of all participants are fully paid in respect of their participation in acres for 23 and 24, payments still have to be issued in respect of some contracts. And he said work is ongoing there. Staying with acres, and decision letters for non-productive investments under the scheme will be issued to farmers in the coming days. These letters are in respect of the third application window for NPIs. Of course, they are the voluntary complementary environmental actions available under the cooperation approach of the scheme, which allow farmers to take specific measures to enhance environmental outcomes on their holdings and to in turn increase their payments as well. Also this week, we saw the reopening of the Common Agricultural Policy Strategic Plan Dairy Beef Welfare Scheme. It's quite a mouthful of a scheme, but it's open for new applicants this week if you're interested. It's designed to support farmers to improve animal health and welfare by using genetically superior beef sows for breeding dairy beef calves. And the scheme offers payment rates of €20 per eligible calf up to a maximum of 50 calves per holding. Now, farmers also being reminded, of course, this week, it's now less than a month to the BIS application deadline for this year. That, of course, is May 15th. I am like beating a drum every week on the podcast, Charles. And the latest figures that we have from the department with just over a month to go when we got these figures was there were over 60,000 BIS and other area-based payment applications submitted to the department. So it's probably around the halfway mark. So as with any year, and it's we're all guilty of it, Charles, there'll probably be a last-minute rush because farmers are quite quite busy at the moment with a lot of jobs on farm, and perhaps paperwork falls down the priority list. But nonetheless, this is a very important deadline. And as we know, there's a range of different schemes that the May 15th deadline does apply to. You can check out a full list of those on our website and app. And also, if you are seeking a nitrates derogation for next year, that deadline for the applications is also May 15th, and the dairy cow ban must also be confirmed for 2026 through the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation, the ICBF's website, before May 15th as well. So there you go, loads of dates for the diary to finish up this week, Charles.
Well, that almost brings us to the end of this week's podcast. Just before we go, we'll just remind you to check out the article from our colleague, Agriland beef specialist Breffney O'Brien, on Michael O'Leary's Jickenstown Angus sale in County Westmeath. The sale, which took place last weekend, featured a 100% clearance rate and an average price of just over €5,100, and all the details from the sale can be seen in Breffney's article. And very finally, the HSE has warned that UV radiation from the sun rises significantly between April and September. So the HSE is calling on all those who work outdoors to prioritise UV protection, including sunscreen and protective clothing. So that is definitely something for farmers to be aware of during the current bright spell. But that's where we'll leave it for this week. Please don't forget to rate, review and follow The Farming Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love if you could spare some time to give us 5 stars and share The Farming Week with anyone you think might be interested. From Aisling, Francis and myself, bye for now.